Okay, folks, I think we're going to make a start just after the bells are finished. And for those of you online and don't know, the bells of the City Town Hall are going to ring every quarter of an hour, but it shouldn't be too intrusive. So welcome to the launch of Feminist Book Fortnight 2022. To those in the room and those online, please do check out our website for the participating shops this year and the events that are happening. We also have a Facebook page with all the events listed on there. Truly welcome, as this is only the second in-person event since COVID. So it's a big deal, and it's really lovely to see people here and to know that people are joining in from all over, which has to be one of the benefits that's happened. Especially welcome to those of you who were there in the 80s, and I know there are some in both rooms. Your memories are no doubt a lot better than mine, and some of you did a lot more work on this than I did. So welcome, special welcome. A bit of housekeeping first. This is our first live stream, so if there's any glitches, just bear with us. If you're online, please put your questions in the Q&A, and one of my colleagues will feed those to me later on. I will repeat questions from the room so that people online can hear them. The format for tonight is going to be that I'm just going to give a little bit of chat about this year's Feminist Book Fortnight, and then I'll hand over to Eleanor, who's going to take us through her research, and then we'll have a bit of a chat, and then we'll take questions. The online audience, we have a brochure that Eleanor's put together. It represents part of her research. If you send us your address, we can send it out to you. So Feminist Book Fortnight this year runs from the Saturday the 14th of May to the 28th of May. Over 30 shops are involved with about 18 events nationally. That's only a little less than pre-COVID. It's difficult to remember now that in 2017, when we had this idea, there was no resurgence in feminist publishing. There was very little diversity all round. We talked about lots of things. We talked about, where are the picture books with black children in them? Where are the positive stories about girls? Almost no black authors were getting published, certainly no black British authors. And that's really difficult to believe now, because there has been a complete change. There was also a conversation in the publishing world about the massive lack of diversity in the people that it was employing. So at Five Leaves, we wanted to contribute to that discussion, and we wanted to make an intervention in that discussion from outside London. And we wanted to apply some pressure to publishers. So relaunching Feminist Book Fortnight, which happened in the 80s, was the result of that. We continued in 2019, and in both years, 2018 and 19, we had over 50 shops and feminist libraries participating. And I can say more on that later if we have time or you have questions, but we'll get on. So I'd especially like to welcome Dr. Eleanor Careless, who, as part of the Business of Women's Words project at the University of Sussex, undertook research into the original Feminist Book Fortnight in the 80s and into its revival in 2018. I can definitely recommend looking at the Business of Women's Words website look at their blog for information about activism in the book trade, complete with links to audio archives. It may not be widely known exactly how numerous feminist publishers were in the 80s and the efforts made by feminists throughout the industry to make those books available, but there's a lot that they've put together on this site that you can look at. Eleanor has been particularly interested in the fact that Feminist Book Fortnight always had an emphasis on focusing outside London. Also evident in her research is the importance of keeping our archives, and one of the great aspects of this research is that all the archives and where they are located is listed. It's a fantastic resource for future generations. Eleanor is currently a research fellow at Northumbria University and is managing editor for the Open Library of the Humanities. And I'm going to hand over to Eleanor, who's going to have some slides, and then we're going to have a chat after that.
Okay, I'm not obscuring the slides, am I? Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. I should just quickly say that I've changed jobs quite a few times recently. I'm actually no longer with the Open Library Humanities, so I just need to make that clear. But I am at Northumbria at the moment. I wanted to start by saying, good evening to my offline and my online audiences, and thank you to Five Leaves for hosting this event. As Jane has already said, I came to Feminist Book Fortnight through my previous work with the Business of Women's Words project, which was based at the University of Sussex and led by Margaretta Jolly. And as part of that project, I was looking at Spare Rib, the iconic feminist magazine, and helping to put together the wonderful Spare Rib map, which is a digital map. You can find it on the British Library website. I'll talk more about it later. But in the process of putting together the map, we were looking at Spare Rib's listings. So the listings of the campaigns, the events, the activities, the protests that the women's liberation movement was organising in the 80s. We were using that data to put together our map. And the listing that stood out for the whole team were the listings for Feminist Book Fortnight, partly for their regularity. In every June issue of Spare Rib from 1984 to the end of Spare Rib's run and the end of the Fortnight's run, the original Fortnight anyway, the listings took up 4 to 5 pages of Spare Rib. And this meant that it became a bit of a lodestone for our digital map, as something to anchor the rest of our data around. And then, of course, Jane's and Five Leaves' wonderful revival of Feminist Book Fortnight really got me asking what started all this, where did it come from, and what is the history here. 2018, when the revived version of the Fortnight first ran, that was the first time the Fortnight had run for 27 years. So I'm going to go back a few decades and give you a quick spin through some of my research and some of my archival findings, and think about the Fortnight's activist aims, its distinctive regionalism, and its relationship with the mainstream literary marketplace. So similarly to now, the Fortnight was an annual British book trade promotion, which involved book launches, readings, signings, and performances, all hosted by independent bookshops all over the country, from Stirling to Londonderry and from Swansea to Deal. And the participating authors included Carol Ann Duffy, Nawal El-Sadawi, Marge Piercy, Buchi Imacheta, Marina Warner, Margaret Atwood, Maya Angelou, Wendy Mulford, Suniti Namjoshi, and then, as now, Deborah Levy, alongside community groups and local writers. So, has that worked? Yes. In 1984, the first year that the Feminist Fortnight, which was then a book week, took place, this was a big year for feminist publishing. The International Feminist Book Fair ran for the first time, drawing in thousands of women all over the world. D.M. Withers has identified this as the moment that feminist publishing steamrolled the mainstream. And the first book week was, in effect, the fair's sister or even daughter event. But whereas the biannual fair travelled the world after this first year, albeit from one Western capital to another, the Fortnight became an autonomous annual event with its own far-reaching regional networks. And those regional networks were initially coordinated by Gail Chester, among others. At its height, the Fortnight involved 500 bookshops and 355 libraries across the UK. That was in 1988. So the feminist, that's the wrong way, 1 minute. The feminist publishing scene was flourishing at this time, in the early 80s. Virago, Sheba, Only Women Press, and the Women's Press were all thriving. Black Women Talk, the first black women's publishing cooperative, was established. It was the year that the Feminist Review published Many Voices, One Chant, a special issue devoted to the writing of feminists of colour. And the extremely successful International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, organised by John LaRose and Jessica Huntley, had already been running for 2 years. It was also the year that Silver Moon Women's Bookshop was established, and there were many other feminist bookshops across the country, from In Other Words in Plymouth to the 1st of May bookshop in Edinburgh. But it was also the year of widespread miners' strikes, of economic hardship and political struggle, 5 years into Thatcher's premiership. In 1986, in fact, I was really delighted to find this, a collection of writing by the Sheffield Women Against Pit Closures group was featured as part of the fortnight in Sheffield. I think the International Feminist Book Fair group put it best when they wrote in the inaugural catalogue that, I'm quoting, "It is indicative of the power of the movement that 1984, that most pessimistic of years, sees the International Feminist Book Fair, an event that has the confidence, strength, and audacity to call for a celebration." So it was a time too of increasing awareness of racial politics within mainstream Britain, in large part due to black protests against racism, and closer connections between black and white women's movements, as well as issue-defining challenges to the white women's movements. The extent of the flourishing of feminist publishing was recognised by the press, as we can see here, breaking barriers in the book trade in The Guardian. No need to be nervous about feminist books. Or as Joy Melville has it, the growth of feminist books has been the publishing success of the decade. And for The Observer in 1988, the British feminist press is alive and proliferating and unequalled in the world. For Every Woman in 1991, it was the biggest feminist event of the year. Many thanks, by the way, to Jane Cholmondeley, formerly of Silvermoon, for these press cuttings. So this all raises the eternal question, what happens to radical political organising when it becomes mainstream? Does it become toothless, co-opted, de-radicalised, and governed by commercial imperatives, as an article by Grace Evans argued in Spare Rib in 1986? Or as Nikki Gerard argued in Into the Mainstream, a book showcased during the 1989 fortnight, can mainstreaming, in fact, be a counterintuitively radical development, a move away from the literature of, in Gerard's words, political angst and domestic oppression? So while feminist literature had always been a vital, even a constitutive part of the women's movement, as Beatrix Campbell put it to Margaretta Jolly during her interview for the Sisterhood and After project, I'm quoting, "We ate the literature that was pouring out of the women's liberation movement. Whether you were an intellectual or not, you just read everything, and it impacted massively on your life." So the production of feminist literature negotiated the opportunities and the hazards of a decade during which the book trade became steadily more consumer orientated. And as one of the fortnight's key organisers, Carol Spedding, put it, the fortnight was driven by a desire to put feminist books, publishing and ideas firmly onto the commercial marketplace. That is, to make more feminist books available to more women. And this question of making feminist literature accessible was something which I came across again and again in my conversations with feminist activists from the time. So one of the most extraordinary achievements of the fortnight was its backing by W.H. Smith, a chain which refused to stock Spare Rib in its early years, and the biggest chain bookseller in Britain at the time. But Smiths printed upwards of 15,000 copies of the fortnight's catalogue in 1986 and stocked many of the 300 or so titles submitted by participating publishers in 150 of their shops during the fortnight, which meant having the word feminist emblazoned across its shop windows. So the fortnight was run through with tensions between its activist aims and its commercial imperatives, publicising itself in all the glossy women's magazines, as well as feminist publications, among them international newsletters such as the American Feminist Bookstore News. But as Jane Anger emphasised to me in an interview, authors, and I'm sorry I'm going to quote Jane here and embarrass her, authors want their books not just to be in the radical shops, they want them to be accessible. If people don't see their books in Smiths, they don't know they're there. Getting those books on the shelves for Feminist Book Fortnight was key, especially for working class writers. The fortnight in the 80s was as much about distribution and placement as it was about publishing. So, I don't know if you can hear those bells chiming, I finished. This is what the fortnight's listings looked like in Spare Rib back in the 80s. At its height, these listings occupied 5 pages of Spare Rib, an unrivaled amount of magazine space given over to one event or item. Lesbian and gay pride listings, by contrast, in another annual June event, took up 1 or 2 pages and no more. Just from these 2 snapshots, you may be able to see that there are events taking place in Bedford, Somerset, Bristol, Dublin, Lancaster, Norwich, Reading and Sheffield. The fortnight's reach extended across the country and into Ireland. This was and continues to be one of the fortnight's greatest strengths, its regional organisation, which intended to shift the WLM's centre of gravity away from London and into parts of the country which did not otherwise have access to feminist literary spaces. The fortnight was sustained too by the very physical labour of the regional organisers. Nothing, as Jane Watts recently reminded me, was digital. Everything was physical. And these organisers were, by and large, radical booksellers. And as well as featuring internationally known authors, a huge amount of events on offer featured local writers and poets. So you might expect to hear, as you could at In Other Words in Plymouth, local performance poets speaking alongside Susie Orbach, the author of Fat as a Feminist Issue. So I've been talking about the catalogues that were produced to accompany the fortnight, and here are some of those catalogues. They were another important and democratising component of the promotion. Demand for copies of the catalogue exceeded 100,000 by 1988. They comprised of the listed titles that were submitted by publishers, and they offered a sliding scale of charges in recognition that the smaller feminist publishers could not afford what the bigger multinationals like Routledge could. And this was just one of the ways in which the fortnight navigated between activist publishing and the mainstream. So this is what the fiction list for 1987 looked like. We've got a title by Hilary Bailey, which is described as the feminist answer to the swashbuckling worlds of John Buchan and Rider Haggard. The latest Tony Cade Bambara, a Juna Barnes republished by Virago Modern Classics, some Elizabeth Bowen, a hilarious satire by Gerd Brantenberg that the owner of this catalogue has annotated as On Order, a long-awaited Angela Carter, a new Buccia Machetta novel, and a Zoe Fairbairn's Whodunit. So these catalogues provided lists of the radical booksellers who stocked and supported feminist writings all year round. And these would have been members of the Federation of Radical Booksellers at the time. The Federation of Radical Booksellers had a not untroubled relationship with the fortnight, in large part due to W.H. Smith's involvement and the threat that more mainstream commercial partners would steal trade from radical booksellers. Of those you can see on this page, many have closed since the 80s, although Gaze, The Word and Hausman's are still alive and well. And the catalogue also listed relevant feminist journals and magazines. In recognition, I'm quoting from the catalogue, that important feminist writing often first appears in their publications, and also the list of participating publishers. So it was truly a who's who of the feminist literary scene, not in terms of individuals, but in terms of the networked organisations that made up that scene. Essentially pragmatic, but also a record of astonishing vision and commitment. A literary landscape peopled by the producers, custodians and vendors of feminist literature. Thanks to Jane Anger for supplying me with copies of the catalogues, which are unobtainable as far as I can make out anywhere else. With the exception of the first catalogue, actually 259, which I managed to buy from Abe Books, I think. So I want to talk briefly about the selected 20, which you saw advertised on the catalogue covers. This is another distinctive feature. I'm just going to get some water, sorry. This is another distinctive feature of the fortnight's more commercial offering. The selected 20 were chosen by an independent panel of booksellers and librarians from among the submitted titles, and they were meant to represent the range and strength of feminist books. Given that about 300 titles were submitted each year, this was a labour-intensive process. That Farah Faruqi, a Sisterite collective member and selected 20 panellist in 1989, remembers as a series of lengthy meetings that were held, believe it or not, in a private members club on Audley Street in London. which Faruqi suggested was meant to confer a sense of the prestige and importance of the proceedings. Faruqi likened the selected 20 to a feminist version of the Booker long list. And in many ways, the 20 titles exemplified what Victoria Bazin has described as the productive paradox of feminist consumption. Practically speaking, the selected 20 were intended as a guide for mainstream bookshops not used to stocking feminist literature, and an alternative to the offerings of the mainstream book industry, but it could not quite escape what Barbara Burford describes as an unsisterly competitiveness, which led author Alison Fell to dub the fortnight Paranoia Book Fortnight. The selected 20 were, here are some of them. It was also criticised in the pages of Spare Rib in 1991 for having an unrepresentative selection panel. In other years, the panels were more diverse, but in 1991 there were no black women on the panel. And so Spare Rib discussed that in the preface to the fortnight listings of that year. And I therefore want to take a moment to highlight the crucial role played by black in the 1980s sense of the word, referring to women of African, Afro-Caribbean, South and East Asian descent, women in making the fortnight the success that it was. The chosen titles year after year demonstrate that writing by black, often American women, was recognised as being of great importance to the women's movement and was moreover highly marketable. And we can see here a novel by El Sadawi and an anthology of contemporary writing by Indian women. In 1989, the selected 20 included authors such as June Jordan and Jamaica Kincaid. And as Francesca Sabande has pointed out, the publication of writing by black women helped to financially sustain feminist publishers such as the Women's Press and Virago in the 1980s and beyond. Black British authors such as Burford toured the country as part of the fortnight, telling Spare Rib that, "I think it is very important to reach women outside London, particularly black women." And the fortnight was in fact an early adopter of new ways of marketing literature, such as author events and book signings. It was pioneered by radical black booksellers such as Eric and Jessica Huntley. So, to return to where I started with the Spare Rib map. The map makes visible one of the most exciting aspects of the fortnight, past and present, which Jane already mentioned, and that is its regional reach. This map, which was launched by the Business of Women's Words project in the British Library in 2020, shows all the events that were listed as part of the fortnight. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those are all the events, because it was often the case that not all events were confirmed before Spare Rib would have gone to print. But if you type Feminist Book Fortnight into the keyword search, you can see clear clusters of events in the Northwest and the Southwest, as well as London. And I've pulled out a selection of snapshots from different parts of the country. So we can see that in Southampton, visiting and local authors in 1984 included Susie Orbach, Bucci Macheta, and a poetry reading, and local authors as well. We can see that in Bristol, Marge Piercy was reading, Margaret Atwood, Marina Warner, Leah Fritz and Wendy Mulford, and that was in 1987. In Cardiff, we had Jo Miller, and I can't read all the, and Beata Lippmann, and that's in 1988, among others. In Norwich, at Freewheel Bookshop, some of the authors included Germaine Greer, Michelle Roberts and Anne Dixon, as well as local women authors. And there's also, I could go on, Darlington Arts Centre even, near Durham. We've got the Green Room in Manchester Poets, and Scottish writers at Stirling District Libraries in 1988, and a book launch in Dublin in 1986. So you can explore the map yourself by going to the Spare Rib section of the British Library website, or simply by Googling Spare Rib map. So to conclude, In 1991, the original fortnight ran for the last time. The radical book trade and the women's movement were in serious decline by this point, and their energies dispersed, in large part due to the growth of new chains since the collapse of the Net Book Agreement. The revival of the fortnight in the 21st century coincides with a resurgence of feminist activism and of independent bookselling. There are some brilliant new additions and initiatives, such as Silver Press and Second Shelf Bookshop, Brighton's The Feminist Bookshop, and Afrori Books, and many more. And there are old challenges. As Jane Anger has said, we felt in 2018 we were having to revisit the same issues some of us campaigned about in the 1980s. And there are new challenges as well. The literary marketplace is now a crowded promotional space. There are important differences between the old and new fortnights. The revived version is decentralised, with no selected 20, and aimed at independent booksellers, no W.H. Smiths this time. And at a time of rampant anti-feminist revanchism, it is very good to see that Feminist Book Fortnight is back. And now more than ever, we need feminist literature for dark times. Lastly, I just wanted to extend heartfelt thanks to all the people without whom I could not have written this short history. Jane Anger, Lucy Delap, Jane Watts, Jane Chomley, Gail Chester, Farah Farouki, Margaretta Jolly, Gay Jones, Jenny Matthews, Beverly Mason, and Anna Wilson, and anyone else whose name I have missed, for their help in assembling the oral histories, archival material, and images that have enabled me to piece together the history of the fortnight, and to show how this promotion, although not without its challenges and frictions, helped to sustain and power a feminist publishing revolution in 1980s Britain. Thank you.
Yep.
Jane Chomley is online watching, and she says greetings from the 1980s.
That's very good. I know there's a number of people from the 1980s online who all did a lot of work towards this. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. That's a fantastic overview, and it does make me feel that that work has been seen and heard, because you've accessed things that, we've had conversations, where are these things? Does anybody remember this? Who's got the archives? And I remember Nan Sloan at an event here, which she wrote a book called Women in the Room, which was about the history of women in the early labour movement. And she was researching the very first women who had been the very first people to organise strikes. And she said at this meeting, in this very shop here, she said, "You women, you throw away your archives." It's been, because she found it unbelievably hard to find the names of the people in photographs she had who had been activists at that time. And this is early in the industrial age. And she said, men don't throw their archives away, women do. And that's why it's so difficult. And that's partly because we did things informally and sat round tables and made lists at home. So I wanted to ask, because this is such an important thing, and you've listed all the archives, and I know the other part of the business of Women's Word stuff has done that. How did you go about finding all these difficult things in places?
It's a very good question. I mean, a huge amount of it was just, I guess, through talking to people and the generosity of many of the people who I listed at the end, including yourself, in sharing personal archives, material that hadn't been thrown away, but was mostly, just in boxes in people's attics, I guess. I mean, there is, of course, the Spare Rib archive, which was also the resource where I started from, and that is an amazing resource. And when I started doing this work, it was still online. It was still the digitized version of Spare Rib, which has now been very sadly taken down due to changes in copyright law after Brexit. But of course, the physical version of that archive is still very much available in the British Library, but also in other feminist archives around the country. So feminist periodicals, I think, are incredibly important as a record of everything that was happening at this time. And partly you see that on pages like listings pages. So rather than simply, the articles and the content of those magazines and periodicals, it's actually those pages which are often forgotten about, where you can really dig around and find some fascinating information, and that was something which I was really led to by the Business of Women's Words project, and by Margaretta and Lucy and Polly, who are part of the team. Of that project, and that's what really led me towards looking at those sorts of the sort of lesser discussed aspects of feminist magazines.
Right. And that's interesting because, as you say, they are the forgotten pages, and also now, I mean, the Feminist Book Fortnight website now is a digital website, and so it's possible to archive those listings, but you can't keep them forever, and you can't keep them in one place. So I think that's going to be an issue for the future about how we preserve that activity.
Yeah, it really is, because even as you say, digital archives are also precarious, and as the digitized spare rib archive demonstrated.
Yes.
And so there's a huge question over like how do you preserve these archives, whether digital or physical.
And which is why at Five Leaves often, if we're doing something, we always produce a physical leaflet. So actually we ought to keep copies of things like that, because we still find that as an effective way of getting things into people's hands in terms of events. Yeah,
and I guess I should also say that the feminist archives that do exist, Feminist Archive North, Feminist Archive South, the Feminist Library in Peckham, Glasgow Women's Library, all these places, and there are others I've forgotten, are also brilliant. LSE Women's Library, they're brilliant repositories as well, but a lot of the time they're underfunded, and catalogues are not always complete. That is changing slowly. Feminist Archive North, for instance, was recently sort of absorbed by the University Library in Leeds, which has meant that they've got sort of greater infrastructure than they did have. But the Feminist Library in Peckham, for example, which is an amazing collection, incredibly rich, but they really need more resource to help with cataloguing. So these repositories are there, and
they're there to do more work on. I remember seeing on another part of the blog, I read the record for the Women's Library at the LSE, the Women's Press Archive, 45 boxes, 10 metres of books uncatalogued, and so it goes on, and you think, oh, what treasure, for researchers. The other thing that came up, particularly in conversation in the room here, before we started, just chatting around with people as you do at a live meeting, it's lovely to do it, is Kate Marsden, who's here, who used to work at Nottingham, said the fact of Feminist Book Fortnight was a real catalyst for them deciding, oh, well, we better do some events. And then it became the events team at Mushroom Bookshop and brought in other people from outside the bookshop to help. So there's a whole team of women here in this room who did that. And did you get that impression, as you were talking from other people around the country, that it somehow made things happen that might not have happened in a more ongoing way?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I did get that sense. When I was talking to Gay Jones about In Other Words in Plymouth, we had a brilliant conversation, which was, again, hugely helpful for me, and talked about how In Other Words, they, I believe, put on a vegetarian banquet to celebrate the end of Feminist Book Fortnight in the early years, and then even after the fortnight stopped happening, this banquet continued to be held into the 90s and beyond, I think. So I think, yes, in terms of a sort of snowball effect generated by the energy of the fortnight, I think, that very much seemed to be the case.
Yeah, and then good things beget good things as well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I might just ask if there's any questions in the room before I go online to see if there's any questions there.
I'm interested in how it went from international to being just British.
So
was it carried on in other countries? Do you know that?
So for the online audience, the question is, how did it go from being international to just British? Did it happen in other countries? That's more about the distinction between the fair and the fortnight, I think.
Yes. So the International Feminist Book Fair itself was held in London in 1984, and that was the first book fair. And after that, it went to different capital cities around the world. Off the top of my head, I went to Melbourne, I think I went to Oslo. I think they tried to send it to Delhi, but that didn't happen. And so the book fair only had 1 year in London, whereas the Feminist Fortnight, which was sort of originally a sort of add-on to the book fair, it then became a recurring event. So after the first Feminist Book Week in 1984, it was so successful, and there was a huge local demand apparently for a repeat of that event. And so the organisers did it again in 1985 and again in 1986, and so it became, I guess, an annual event in quite an organic way. And it was always held in Britain and Ireland, but there were, I think, 2 other Feminist Book Fortnights, one in Bangladesh and one, I forget where the other one was held, but I think it was 1988, where there were a couple of sort of spin-offs of the fortnight in other parts of the world as well.
And Feminist Book Fortnight now has a participating shop in Venice, who, before COVID, put on umpteen events, including events in women's prisons and all sorts of things. So, yes, that's a really important distinction between the two. And the other thing it's good to say is that the reason it's the UK and Ireland is because the Booksellers Association of Great Britain is of Great Britain and Ireland. So the book trade in both countries works together very closely and has one overarching trade association. And so that's why the whole book trade would have worked together in all these islands. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I wonder if you'd say something about the nature of the events. I mean, you sort of hinted that they were changing in the 80s, the way of promoting books. So can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I was really intrigued by this as I was doing my research, because the idea of a book signing, a book launch, feels to me like sort of quite an obvious thing to do. But when I spoke to various different people, it seemed that as a way of promoting a new book, this, at least to a number of the people I spoke to, felt like quite an innovative way of going about book promotion at that time in the 80s. And I actually went to a talk which was about black bookshops in London, and that was where I think I heard about Jessica Huntley pioneering this sort of author-led event in radical bookshops, and this sort of seemed to mesh with the narrative that was coming out of other feminist booksellers I was talking to. And then, it is definitely the case that in the 1980s the book trade really did transform in terms of just in terms of things like book prizes really took off, and just the sort of the consumer oriented style of book promotion really got going at that time, and so it seemed to be part of that pattern, I suppose, a different way of doing of selling books.
I think they learnt a lot from the feminists. I think they saw those queues down the Charing Cross Road for Maya Angelou. It was literally down the road to Leicester Square. They saw what was happening, and I think it blew the rest of the trade away, really, that you could do that. So I think we contributed to that idea of authors going into shops, and now, of course, it's become the author tour, and that's pushed, and Waterstones' block booked or somewhere is block booked. It's not what we do. We don't tend to go for that. We go for the conversations we want to have, and we set our own agendas, and so do a lot of the other radical and independent bookshops, and we've always done that. We don't tend to go for the big tours. So there is a split in the trade there as to how that's done. Doesn't mean we won't host a big author if we want to. We have done that with 400 people, but we want to look at the conversations that we want to have. I just wondered if there were any questions online.
Yeah, we've got two from Margaretta Jolly, as it happens. What was the most memorable event of the original Feminist Book Fortnight for you personally, I'm guessing?
Okay, what was the most memorable event of the Feminist Book Fortnight. Of which one?
The original Feminist Book
Well,
Fortnight.
I have to say, I can't remember because it was the year that Silver Moon opened and we were working our socks off. And, do you know, it's gone. Jane Chumley has a much better memory than me, and she will have written it down, what was going on then, and what was the one?
My one was seeing Audre Lorde. It was
Jane-
a life-changing moment.
Jane Watts was seeing Audre Lorde in a life-changing moment, and I think that was true for a lot of people. That was a big event in London.
The second question is, in light of the question about W.H. Smith's, would you object to chain mass market or franchise bookshops
So-
promoting the Feminist Book Fortnight today?
Okay, so should I repeat that for the people online? So in the light of the stuff about W.H. Smith's, would we look at having a chain involved? Is that the question?
Yeah. Would we object to it?
Would we object to it? Okay, so the current Feminist Book Fortnight was set up for independent bookshops. There is only one real chain in this country, and that's Waterstones. They've got a big budget. We don't have big budgets. It's not set up for them. They're welcome to do something of their own, but we're not going to do that work for them. So that's we are working on a shoestring here with lots of labour. Pippa, that the team everybody at the team at Five Leas has contributed to the efforts to make this work. That's true right around the country, and that was true of the radical shops in the 80s. This was evening work fitted around the daytime job, massive work. People, I know that people were exhausted at the end of the original Feminist Book Fortnights with the efforts but wanting to do it. So I don't object to what the chains can do what they want. It probably won't be our agenda, and it's not something we want to get involved in, to be blunt.
Jane Chumley said she can remember Audre Lorde coming to Silver Moon and her dog Biff laying at her feet in adoration.
Oh, great. Biff laid at everybody's feet in adoration except mine. Yeah, I mean, what was great was, when you read that list out of authors like Marge Piercy going to Bristol, was what is fantastic to hear is how there were all these authors, feminist authors, around the country, and I know that took a lot of work on behalf of the workers who were doing that at the time. I think that was both Carol and Gail, but I may be wrong. But and also all the people out in the regional shops, getting that timetable together, fitting it with the visits of which authors were going to be in the country, because people came to the country for that reason. It was a massive effort, but of course, look at the results. It did raise the profile of feminist books, and that's what this effort is about. And I think it's interesting that it's not just chance we hit on a zeitgeist by reviving Feminist Book Fortnight. There were very few feminist books being published in 1987, but lots of conversations were being happened. So it's like these conversations in publishing outside the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, all come together and put pressure on the people who have the power to make decisions about who gets published. And that is one of the key things. It's who has the power about things being published, and that's the conversation we want to keep moving on, and we don't want it to be a trend.
And that question of
Go on.
I guess sort of owning the means of production in that sense, and of course that's what the incredibly hard work that, as you say, that organisers put in, and again that just came up again and again. People telling me that they have never been so exhausted in their whole life as they were at the end of the fortnight. But I guess, all of that work was going into constructing a means of communication, and that was by establishing these spaces where feminists could come together, where authors could meet readers and readers could meet authors, and as you say, and could also then put pressure on publishers to publish feminist books.
Yeah, and it was about getting together to do that, and also I know that you wrote about that in your research in terms of the networks. Nothing got done without networks. There was women in the book trades as an organisation. There was women in libraries as an organisation. There was women in publishing as an organisation, and women in all those organisations worked together to get things moving. So the women who had power within women in libraries, who had buying power, bought the bloody books for the libraries so that their readers could see the books. Women in publishing, if they influenced what they could, if they could get to be editorial. And don't forget, this is a time when most women who started in publishing had to start as a secretary. Once they got power to commission stuff, then they could use that power. And then it's about putting those networks together and working with your allies and getting things done, and getting things done despite the fact that publishing was patriarchal, white, overwhelmingly male in every aspect. So it's just making your own agenda and trying to find a way of getting it done. And frankly, it's never been easier technically to publish a book. Distribution is another matter. But it's never been easier to print a book. Yes?
Can I ask, is it more difficult now to define what is a feminist book?
Do you want to answer that, or should I?
I think that was a live question at the time as well. From memory, I think I remember seeing this discussed. I mean, what was interesting actually about a lot of the original events, as well as current events during the fortnight, is there's quite a lot of introspection, and there were discussions of, what it meant to mainstream women's writing in the 80s. And I'm pretty sure there were discussions about, what are we classing as a feminist book for our current purposes. I imagine, Jane will have some thoughts on this, but I imagine it usually came down to something quite pragmatic in terms of if a participating publisher, and of course if they were anyway a feminist publisher, then that effectively would have been the way to categorise those books as feminist. In terms of the more mainstream publishers who were involved, I imagine the fortnight organisers would have exerted some discretion, but beyond that, I don't really know. And then in terms of now, I'm going to hand over to Jane.
I think it's easier to say, you know what it's not when you see it. So when you look at a book, no, this isn't. I suppose it's a broad area because, for example, the small presses do most of the heavy lifting on the really interesting radical stuff of any kind, mostly. When in 2018 we started Feminist Book Fortnight, suddenly there was a little splurge of books about 50 women who did this and 50 famous women who did that, and those are still alive, those books, and they have their place. But there became a lazy form of publishing for the next 2 years about that. So whenever a publisher would say, we've got a feminist book for you, you can guarantee it was something like that. And in the end, we said, we've got plenty of books like that, go and do something else. And they do actually stop selling. If publishers jump on a bandwagon, a lazy bandwagon, actually they end up not selling. But some of those early books, like Rebel Girls, was tremendously important. And I went to, I do a lot of bookstores as part of my work, and I was at the Derby International Women's Day, did that several years before COVID. And the young girls who came up to the stall always made a beeline for that book, showed it to their mum or their grandma or their dad who was with them and said, we've got this book at school, look at this is great. So that book, you could say, was a bit of lazy publishing, but it made a difference, and maybe that's what's the important thing, is whatever makes the difference to somebody. But I know what's not feminist when I see it.
I was thinking that I guess actually the curation of the catalogues, which I mentioned, is probably one way in which, and even the selected 20 panellists, because they were reading all of these books between them. And that would have, to an extent, I guess, curated those lists. But I guess the other thing, your question makes me think about is, that T-shirt slogan, the T-shirt that David Cameron put on a few years ago. This is what a feminist looks like. The problem is, of course, the term feminist can be co-opted, and it can be, used in lazy ways, and it has very much been commodified. And I guess. Yeah, the question. I really don't think that I have the answer at all to defining a feminist book, but it's definitely a very live question. Yes.
Go go on. Yes, go on.
Just
Yeah.
saying, I've got a watcher from Chicago.
Oh, okay. Somebody from Chicago. Excellent. This is very good.
So the first question is from Katie Holmes. Did the Feminist Book Fortnight include non-fiction authors?
So from Katie Holmes, did the Feminist Book Fortnight include non-fiction authors?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah. Yes, it definitely did. Yes. Yes.
There's actually a whole section devoted to non-fiction in the catalogues as well. I just happened to choose the fiction section because that's my favourite.
So a question from Rosie Mack. In your research, were you able to find any records from the process of organising any of the fortnights?
Sadly, no. No, I really have not been able to find anything. I tried to find something in Feminist Archive South because they do have a lot of the sort of spare rib administrative papers, but there doesn't seem to be anything there. Of course, I could be wrong. And none of the activists I spoke to had, well, actually I say that's not quite true. Gay Jones sent me some very interesting documents from the organisation of the fortnight in the Southwest, that in other words coordinated. And some of that material included grant letters to Southwest Arts, putting in, a bid for a certain amount of money to help with author travel costs and so on and so forth. So there's a few things like that, but by and large, no, and I don't know where that could be found. I'd be delighted if anyone else did.
I think they'd be lists on people's kitchen tables and they made a quick phone call or something. But there is somebody you could talk to in the room later about that.
Okay, great.
Yes. Any more?
Yeah, if you could repeat this after I've said it. From Chicago, Elaine, I think the name is, would like to know about the place of specifically gay and lesbian publishing houses and bookshops in the fortnight.
So Ghislaine from Chicago would like to know specifically about the place of gay and lesbian publishing houses in the fortnight. Brilliant's books published mostly books by men, as far as I remember. All the feminist publishers published some books about or by lesbians. There were also a lot of imports from the States. That was where we got a lot of books from.
I think there may have been a section in the catalogue.
Ah, right.
I'm trying to remember, actually.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that. There may have been a section devoted to books by lesbian authors or queer authors, and of course there were many bookshops like Gay's the Word that were also involved.
And also all the radical bookshops would have had gay and lesbian sections, and so that some of the author events would have been chosen with that in mind. There were lots of lesbian. When I was at Silver Moon, we were importing most of our lesbian books from the States. Lesbian Nuns was big. It was a great book. Coming out stories from lesbian nuns. It was fantastic. Any more questions online? No?
We have two in the audience.
Two? Yes. Kate.
I just want to mention the mushroom book events, and if you could put in a plug that if anyone's got any memories or memorabilia from the 80s, we'd be delighted to have it because we're trying to develop an archive from it.
Okay. Kate Marsden, who used to work at Mushroom, was one of the players in this catalyst effect of starting Mushroom events based on what was happening in Feminist Book Fortnight. And there's 3 people here who were closely involved, and they are putting together an archive. And if anybody out there, online or anywhere else, has any memories of those events at Mushrooms or documents relating to them, they'd be interested. You can always reach her through 5 Leaves if you want. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I found a little bit in the Virago archives in the British Library from like a publishing point on their relationship with organising things for feminists. Book Fortnight. And then I have a question in terms of it.
Amazing, thank you.
Okay.
That's okay.
Let me just repeat that for online people. So one of the people in the room has been looking at the Virago archive in the British Library, and she's found something from one of the publishers about their involvement in organising the fortnight. And you have a question.
Just how did you get interested in this for your research? What led you to get interested
So
in it?
how did Eleanor get interested in this for her research?
It was really sort of, I guess, yeah, it's through my work on Spare Rib, and my work especially on the listings pages of Spare Rib and building the Spare Rib map. And so it was just spending all this time, because I had to, it was quite a process actually, inputting lots of listings data into a spreadsheet so that our developer could then turn it into a map. And spending all of that time with these listings, it was the fortnight that really stood out. I guess it was just that sense that that I got that it was such an event in the feminist calendar. And it was sort of something which, given that it ran for 8 or 9 years, there was a clear sort of sense of anticipation in the run up to the fortnight. It just felt a bit of a linchpin for lots of other sorts of feminist enterprise that was going on, and also and Jane mentioned networks earlier. But I guess it also felt like a bit of a meeting place for all of those networks, and a place where, already established organisations like Women in Publishing, but also women's studies in universities, and the booksellers, but also the publishers and the authors. And it all kind of came together, and librarians as well. And it sort of all came together during the fortnight and produced this very sort of outward-facing nationwide network of events and literary counterpublics. So I think it just felt like a sort of a distillation, I guess, of a lot of the activity that was going on at the time.
I just want to say that you've alluded to the tension with working in the capitalist marketplace, and that was all going on. It was quite a capitalist thing that at one point the net book agreement went, and there was lots of competition between the different bookshop chains. So there was always tension with that, but you're always trying to do what you can within that system. And I would say a bit of that has changed now with it's more of a gift economy since COVID, and just before COVID, the rise of crowdfunding now, and the way it's enabled some bookshops to buy their premises and things has been quite liberating in terms of you still have to operate in that economy, but you're not quite so tied to the banks and things. And also the fact that people understand more about local and supporting, they really understand if you want a bookshop, you've got to use it. So that has shifted in the last 2 years, I think, a bit.
It's a really fascinating way as well, as you say, to think about just the economics of book selling.
Yeah.
Because, when the International Feminist Book Fair was funded by the Greater London Council, which then was dissolved by Thatcher's government. And so, but there was a moment again in the early 80s when a huge number of feminist projects and similarly like radical political projects were being funded by the Greater London Council. And again, therefore they weren't, wrapped in to a capitalist economy. They had other sources of funding. And the Feminist Fortnight, as far as I know, wasn't really funded by the GLC directly. But it did have, it had the sort of the launch pad of GLC funding in the form of the first book fair, and then it did have access to funding from regional organisations like Southwest Arts, and there was a sort of a municipal sort of feminist organising that was going on in the 80s that I think it sort of plugged into as well, and I talk about that greater length in my longer article on the fortnight. Forthcoming.
Something to look forward to. We're kind of running out of time. Are there any more questions online? Okay, yep, one more. Yep.
Margaretta Jolly would like to know, without re-invoking Paranoid Fortnight, what would be included in your selected 20 this year?
I don't do selected 20s, Margaretta. So Margaretta asked what would be in my selected 20 this year. I don't do it. I don't go there because everything's... I know, shortlists, we have stuff from prizes in the shop, we have shortlists. You need to do it in order to give a voice and give a space to particular books. And we all have our different ways of doing that. The Women's Prize has a way of doing that. The Jalak Prize for books by people of colour, which we've got in the window at the moment, that's all important. But there's no need now to choose a top 20. And that's why Feminist Book Fortnight now is decentralised. So although I coordinate it and my labour is paid for by Five Leaves, it's deliberately more democratic in that each shop does its own thing. They interpret it in their own way, they use the authors they want to use, and that way it becomes their conversation they want to have in their community, with their community, or what their community wants to have in the shop. And so that's the way it works there. No top 20 for me.
I'm going to leave Jane with the last word there, I think.
Okay, I think we should draw that to a close because the town hall just chimed 7 o'clock. I would just like to say thank you to everybody for coming in both rooms and for taking the time to attend. It's been joyous to be in the room again. Thank you to Eleanor for doing such important work and bringing together many voices and resources about Feminist Book Fortnight. As I said, I do feel seen, and I do feel that our current contribution to activism around diversity, it's a small bit of booksellers action, but it's made a difference. So these things fade, and everybody would like this to be a trend. They just like the rise in publishing, and I know that Nikesh Shukla said the same thing. We mustn't let this be a trend. It mustn't pass. We must keep our foot on the pedal. And the patriarchy just loves that to happen, and we mustn't let that happen. So let's keep our eye on the ball. At Five Leaves, here at Five Leaves, we've got a few more events for Feminist Book Fortnight. We've got a great little book group talk and chat about speculative fiction. It's been one of the rising trends in interest from feminists at the moment, which is whether you call it sci-fi or fantasy fiction or whatever. What seems to be written now is very involved with social justice issues, so we're having an evening in the shop. It's not going to be live streamed, talking about that with Hannah Marie Robbins, and we're also having we're going history. We're looking at the feminist magazines of the past. It's called The Tide Comes In, after Time and Tide, and we're having that in conjunction with NTU in the shop, looking at the feminist magazines of the past. So if you want to come along to that, do bring your feminist magazines. If you can dredge up the names of them from your memory, do all that. So finally, I'd like to say thank you very much to Eleanor, and goodbye to those people online. Thank you very much for attending. We're going to just have a little chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane.